Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dorcas, for the introduction. And I appreciate the flexibility of people doing this on Zoom. So let me begin by saying to you that this is a subject that is vast and wide. And it's been an interesting adventure. I entitled it Forgiveness, a Gift or Not, because I wasn't sure about it. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. When you hear the word forgiveness, what thoughts or feelings come up for you? Just notice. Take a moment. Forgiveness. What comes up? I'm pretty sure that each of us has a different response, a different feeling, a different image. When I began delving into this topic of forgiveness, I asked the same question to about 7 people. I asked them, when you hear the word forgiveness, what arises in you? I only wanted their first reaction. I didn't push it for any content so that people would feel safe answering to me. Thoughtfulness was what my friend Joe said. One woman insisted with easy conviction, there are some people I will never forgive. Another painfully responded, I have never forgiven myself. Discomfort was another. 2 others said separately, it's like freedom. It lifts a weight from my shoulders. And yet still others said, God. As many know, forgiveness is a concept taught across religions. In Christianity, forgiveness is considered a central message, and Jesus speaks of it many times, modeling the ultimate forgiveness act when he asks his Father to forgive those who knew not what they were doing. In Islam, forgiveness is considered a virtue that's rewarded by God, and that forgiveness can achieve anything. Buddhism, forgiveness is considered a means of dealing with the emotional pain of life's impermanence. It supports the principle of non-attachment, to ideas, to concepts, to things, to hurts. Judaism, forgiveness is a central theme of Yom Kippur, through atonement, to set the next year clean, with a clean slate to move forward. Humanist Clee Jones says, to err is human and to forgive is human. He goes on, he says, if forgiveness is a way to hide from confrontation and ignore evil, then I'm against it. But if forgiveness is the delicate balance between truth and love, that confronts evil and oppression without sliding into cynicism and apathy, he says, I'm all for it. It may come as no surprise, all of us. Felix Adler says, the most effectual aid to forgiveness is faith in the better nature of the wrongdoer. So it's clear to see that forgiving is no easy concept, always challenging, so it's no wonder that the religions are always continually teaching it. Turning back to my interviewees, I then asked them, so what do you think stops people from forgiving? Here are some answers. Feeling like I'm weak or giving in. Ego. Need to be right. Need to keep safe. They don't deserve it. Or so I never forget. Then I heard Joe say, I have been forgiven. And believe it or not, my bad behavior stopped. And then with his marvelous laughter, he says, and they remind me all the time that they forgave me. So he had a sweet sense of humor about that. It looks to me like as long as they're humans, there will be hurts, injustices, and injury. I've come to the conclusion, and it's clear to me now, that forgiveness is subjective, complex, challenging, with as many variables as there are people. And there is no right or wrong way based on each of our collective circumstances. When I began researching this topic, I found myself taken down myriad paths, turning me in every direction on the emotional compass of life. So in an attempt to just offer a path or two for us today, it might be enough to say that forgiving can be seen on kind of two intersecting continuums, from small irritation to insult to injury. And the second intersection continuum is the duration and significance of a relationship. Both seem to be supported by our conscious and unconscious beliefs about the world. For example, if you don't have much invested in a relationship and it isn't a big injury, then forgiving, even forgetting is pretty straightforward. You may hear, gee, I'm sorry. Or you may say, gee, I'm sorry. And indeed, forgiveness may occur. But if you have a lot invested in a relationship, or you're married to a belief of how it should be, and sometimes the tiniest things can feel enormous. And of course, different people react differently. As I said to you, it's an enormous subject, so what I'd like to do is explore two major categories. And believe me, I'm no expert in this, but I'm fascinated by it. So let's focus on forgiving others and forgiving ourselves. What is most important is that each, and a small caveat of the first one, requires the cognitive, motivational, emotional experience of decreasing negativity and increasing positivity towards an offender in the adversity sense of it. So in other words, choosing to forgive means to consciously decide, recognize the worth of it, actually feel the pain you felt when the event occurred, and begin to look at the experience from various and possibly new points of view. Here's something I find fascinating. The benefits of forgiveness often favor the person who is forgiving more than the person being forgiven. Think about that. The benefits of forgiveness often favor the person who's forgiving more than the person being forgiven. And it is never about undoing the affront. It can facilitate moving forward in a more satisfactory way. For example, it took me a very long time to forgive a woman who I invited to co-author a book with me after an agent asked me to consider writing a particular book on a niche subject. The agent had discovered me through my articles in the New York Post, and I had asked a colleague to give it a try with me. She would write certain chapters and I would write the others. No contract had been signed, we just thought we'd give it a shot. When I read her first chapter, I saw blatant plagiarizing, like right out of a book. I called her on it immediately and she denied it. I was left with no alternative, and I said I couldn't work with her going forward. She, late that evening, called the agent, said she was working independently now, and they signed the contract. There are a few words invented that could approximate how I felt: shock, alone, betrayed, stunned. In the end, she wrote the book. Only after years of reflecting and trying to understand how someone could do that to me, a friend of mine said, how about if you look at it this way? What possible reasons would make a person do that? I shifted my view. I thought that the likelihood, without casting disparaging ideas, the likelihood of this person getting an agent on her own was really rather small. I had the exposure, she didn't. Suddenly I realized, wow, that must have been an act of, not a person, an act of desperation on her part. I suddenly felt compassion arise for her. And I forgave her. Not to her personally, since we had long lost contact, but in my heart. And it worked. It took years, because it's not easy. It felt good. The field of psychology has extensively studied the effects of forgiving and not forgiving on our mental and physical health. I'm sure you must know that. According to Psychology Today, an article shows that forgiveness can lead to a reduction in stress, anxiety, depression. It can elevate your mood, blood pressure, enhance optimism, even guard against anger. However, it also notes sometimes giving ourselves permission not to forgive can be problematic, loading resentments, self-blame, which is big, stress, or it can bring the very sense of stress release and emotional freedom that forgiving can bring. So we have choices. Choose to forgive or not to forgive is always private and personal. Our backgrounds, beliefs, experiences, temperaments, as well as the significance of our relationships are critical to these decisions. I mean, look, just take a minute, think about your lives. What did or didn't you see growing up when it came to holding grudges or forgiving? Did you have a parent that was the uber grudge holder? Did you see family members not talk to each other for decades and hear everybody judge that? Do you have a family that believed that it's a dangerous world out there? All black and white? Or you're lucky enough to have a family that modeled apologies, took responsibility for their behaviors. All this impacts how we address the issue. Just to be clear, there is no right or no wrong way to forgive or not to forgive. It's complex. In an ideal scenario, both parties could own up to the insult and reconcile. But forgiving is not a guarantee of reconciling, and it is never about undoing, getting the other to change. It's especially hard if the person who hurt you doesn't admit the wrongdoing. So you might wonder, okay, I'm getting a little restless now. Is there something I can do, or what can you give me, or whatever? So I thought, how do you get unstuck with the hurt? Well, one way is the way I learned. Try seeing the situation from the other person's point of view. As I told the story, practice empathy. You might ask yourself about the circumstances that might have led that person to behave that way, and just perhaps you might have reacted similarly if you had faced the same situation. Or maybe take a moment and reflect on the times when others have forgiven you. And what did that feel like? It's always a process. Even small hurts may need to be revisited and forgiven again and again. Certainly, if somebody has died, reconciliation is impossible. And sometimes it may not be appropriate. But still, if we choose to forgive or not forgive, it's possible. Remember, when you forgive, don't expect change. It just can't be done. It's really about focusing on what you can control in the here and now. Maybe you could think about forgiveness more about how it could change your life by bringing you peace, happiness, and emotional and spiritual healing. It can also take away the power that you have let the other person continually have up until that forgiving moment. Just think about that. An interesting paper published in Germany hypothesized and proved that as a forgiver, only those who have emotionally forgiven a transgression, and not those who have just given lip service for forgiveness, the words only those ones who have done the emotional work subsequently forget offensive, relevant traits attributed to the transgressor, which is very interesting. Please remember, there's no right or wrong way. Some are more effective than others. The question is, what's going to be best for you? Dr. Jean Safer, surprised me in her book, Forgiving and Not Forgiving. And she says that if you hold the belief, as I have done most of my life, that the more you can forgive, the more loving you are, can be, in her words, wildly problematic. It felt like she was peeking into me. When it's too painful to deal with the underlying feelings of betrayal, rage, revenge, suffering, forgiving on the surface acts to avoid those feelings. It does not, however, help heal the sufferer from the inside out. And the biggest surprise to me was her research showing that, believe it or not, the same emotional benefits can sometimes come from choosing not to forgive. She says that when we choose not to forgive, the non-forgiver is honoring their feelings over everything else. I have to tell you that stopped in my tracks, because I would often judge others when they would say, I'll never forgive him, them, her. They knew their feelings. Who knows? Maybe they were healthier than I. So shocked to read her words, I was struck with a feeling that over the years, most likely I had forgiven way too many, way too soon. Maybe it's because I learned to adapt to myriad changes in my first 7 years of life and didn't know what my feelings were. Maybe I grew up with a lack of learning of how to access and express them. Regardless, Safer made me realize that I had forgiven too many too soon, and suddenly I started judging myself. You screwed up, Judy. Look what you did. Oh, now what are you going to do? And I really, honest to God, I started giggling, because the irony wasn't lost on me. So now I'm learning to forgive myself for having forgiven too many too quickly. So humor isn't lost on me. It's my project. So I guess some people's beliefs are that they should just be the good guys. Now I wonder, what cost? Note to the elders listening in, by the way. Research also shows that older people choose to forgive one person and not another, maybe because they're choosing what is right for them instead of what is expected of them. age advantages. Needless to say, I think you're getting the picture. Forgiving others requires hard work, a willingness to feel and acknowledge that you're hurt. Accepting the pain as your own, becoming honest with yourself about the effect that it's had on you, and how you may have held onto the hurt more and made it bigger than necessary. It takes a heavy amount of vulnerability, susceptibility, and strength to emotionally forgive. One of the things that might be running around in your mind, because it would in mine, you might say, well, what about like grudge holding? It's an interesting obstacle and certainly can block forgiving. A grudge is kind of like holding on to hurt or anger against another because of an actual or perceived wrong. It can be short-lived or persist over time, sometimes creating actual potential health risks. Some have said that holding on to a grudge is like swallowing poison in hopes that the other person dies. Grudges can bring anger and bitterness into new relationships and experiences. It can wrap you up in the wrongs of yesterday so that you can't enjoy the present. Certainly it can create depressions because it be turning anger inwards. Certainly if you're running around with that, you possibly could lose valuable and enriching connections with others. I said we were going to talk about forgiving others and forgiving ourselves. I talked about forgiving others and not forgiving others, but what about forgiving ourselves? It's actually the same process, but all too often we're unaware. We're unconsciously punishing ourselves for our mistakes, misunderstandings, and even misdeeds. And we're really good at making it bigger and wider and wilder. We can ruminate, we can amplify, we can augment a mishap and grow it way out of proportion. We often carry around what we call guilt. What I've learned, guilt is one way to just make a rut for yourself. Slowly just make it worse and worse. Unless it allows you to say, I feel so guilty, I'll never do that again. To me, that's regret, not guilt. So if you change the label to regret, instead of feeding it guilt food that only poisons the system, then regret could be like a springboard for future compassion, doing it better the next time. Where guilt just digs its claws into us with no energy forward. You know that saying? How does it go? If you cannot truly love yourself, you can't truly love the other person. We've all heard that, right? If you can't love yourself, then you can't love anybody else. But for today, I'd like to add another. How about, as long as you cannot forgive your own mistakes, you cannot forgive others. We project so much. It may look like we've forgiven others, it may look like we've forgiven ourselves or others, yet the unconscious mind doesn't lie. So if the forgiveness is a frivolous fake, bad feelings of guilty, or anger or shame will often appear in unconscious ways, and certainly, as research says, in our dreams. I want to make this clear. Forgiving ourselves doesn't mean getting a free pass and not be held accountable. The burden of carrying the mistakes that we've made in our lives is kind of like carrying a full sack of heavy rocks on our back, even on our hearts. And it can either break one or both. We need to remind ourselves that no one is perfect. And if there is forgiveness in the world, there needs to be errors as well. When we choose to see forgiveness this way, I think it becomes clear that it's also freedom. Like two of my interviewees, release, a weight lifted, freedom from the past, and even perhaps freedom from future victimization. Because when you forgive the events from your past, either from what others have done or what you've done, they no longer define or control your present, thus your future. So by taking life's pitfalls as opportunities to grow, instead of places to dwell in hopelessness, you're reclaiming your power, you're reclaiming your life. Forgiving others or not forgiving others, forgiving ourselves, depends on various factors, including the acknowledgement that every situation is different. Every situation is personal. Every situation doesn't always work out. Sometimes it's like cotton and linen. As a young married, early on, I was ironing a light blue linen dress. All smooth, all perfect. I like to iron. And I put it on, and it got all wrinkly in a second. So I took it off, figuring I was doing it wrong, and I ironed it again, and I put a little more steam on it, and I put it on again, and it didn't stay ironed. It got wrinkly again. Totally frustrated, figuring I was a complete failure when it came to ironing. Found out that linen is supposed to be wrinkly. That's the nature of linen. You can't iron out all the wrinkles. I wonder what that has to do about life. There's some places where you just have to let it be wrinkly. It's its nature. So forgiving others, not forgiving others, forgiving ourselves, as far as I'm concerned, maybe they are gifts. Gifts that can free us from feeling stuck, release us from the past, and open paths for ourselves and others to new and future possibilities. Forgiving others requires acknowledgement, vulnerability, to open shuttered doors and tight light to come in. Not forgiving others and without holding judges, honors your feelings, perhaps a private gift for yourself. Forgiving yourself takes grit and honesty again and again to release yourself from the suffering so you can feel free to move ahead. Gift. So this talk was called Forgiveness. Gift or not. So what do you think? Thank you.